Good morning.
Good morning.
I should like to begin by thanking you for your intellectual hospitality to Olive Sr., as well as your hospitality to me during this month and our consideration of the stories from Senior's canon, and especially to you, John, for your incredibly fine theological, pedagogical imagination in adult education. When we began our study of Olive Senior's canon and first entered the short story, The Pain Tree, we discussed how the particular subgenre of prose in which Senior presents that story is the dramatic monologue. Lorraine is the monologuist who confesses to us as her auditors the life that she has experienced in this colonial setting upon her return 15 years earlier. And we conclude this session with returning to that subgenre of the dramatic monologue. The narrator of Confirmation Day, the monologuist, is telling us this story. It's a form of confessional literature from the time in which she was to be confirmed in the Church of England. We do not know the monologuist's name. We do not know the age at which she is currently telling us this event from her life. We can infer that perhaps the age at which this event is taking place is as early as the age of 12. It is the practice in the Anglican Church for one to be confirmed at the age of 12 or in the early teenage years. Confirmation, as we know in the Christian Church, is the rite at which a baptized person, especially one who is baptized as an infant, affirms the Christian belief and is admitted as full member of the church. The bishop anoints one with chrism, with the consecrated oil, and one is to be sealed with the gift of the Holy Spirit. One is initiated then into the Christian community. The faith that is given in baptism is then confirmed, and it was the practice in the early church to signify the rite of confirmation, known as sealing, by having a tattoo that was representative of one's faith. It was curious the other day, my Uber driver had a rosary hanging from his mirror, and I asked him if he were Catholic, and he said no, that he was Orthodox. And then he showed me his wrist, and he had a small tattoo of the cross right here to signify that he had been confirmed in the faith. He had been sealed by the ink of the tattoo. The focus in confirmation is upon the Holy Spirit, who on the 50th day of Easter, Pentecost, the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles, confirming them and giving them the courage to practice the faith. We are taken onto the occasion of the monologuist confirmation in the Anglican Church, and what I find curious is that just as the letter J is missing from the sign, which should read, if all the colors and signs were blinking, enjoy Appleton, drink Sprite. Appleton is the oldest rum distiller in Jamaica. That is juxtaposed against drink Sprite, but the J is missing. The word, the one consonant that would really express joy, enjoy. And I think what's curious is, in her own way, Senior changes the word confirm by taking out the I and implying from the perspective of the monologuist that this was more of a conforming. The question then becomes not who is confirmed, but what is confirmed. And from the perspective of the speaker, what is confirmed for her on this day is that she does not want to conform to either this particular practice of her grandmother, nor has the tradition of her mother in the effort to baptize her, from which she flees, not to be confirmed by that conformity as well. And so all of this then takes us, John, to the epigraph with which Senior begins the narrative from the writings of the German Catholic poet Rainer Maria Rilke, from his collection of verses under the title The Duino Elegies. Duino is a province in Trieste, Italy. The speaker in the epigraph asks the question, and it's presented in the subjunctive, in the conditional tense. Who, if I cried, would hear me among the angelic orders? Who, if I cried, would hear me among the angelic orders? Now, by virtue of her employing this epigraph from Rilke's Duino Elegies, it becomes incumbent then upon the reader to imagine the significance of the epigraph, what the function of this epigraph is in relation to the dramatic monologue. The interrogation, who, if I cried, would hear me among the angelic orders? How may one interpret the tone of that question? And how does that then support the monologue?
I think she's expressing doubt that anybody's actually going to.
Yes, doubt.
Everybody's listening.
Yes.
I was, not only that I would cry, but would anybody listen?
Yes.
Because I think she's also strong.
Oh, yes. At the end of this monologue, like the end of Bright Thursdays, Laura, who orphans herself, the speaker, the monologuist in Confirmation Day, is also declaring her independence from this conformity that the grandmother and the institutional Anglican Church wish to impose upon her. And there is this posture of profound solitude. Who, if I cried, would hear me among the angelic orders? This is a plaintive, this is an invocation of despair, of profound solitude, and as you say, of doubt as well. There is not this sense of assuredness at all on the part of the speaker. So what is confirmed is not so much the speaker in the actual ritual on this particular Sunday. What is confirmed for her is that all that she is experiencing through her sensory faculty and through her sense of reason does not come together. It does not converge. Just as the grandmother sings off key, everything is off key in the sensibility of this young confirmand. Nothing converges. Instead, there is this collision, this succession of collisions. Nothing makes sense to her. And it's in the mind of this young, impressionable girl that all of these discrepancies and all of these contradictions, all of these moments of off-key are expressed to us. So what is confirmed is this overwhelming sense that nothing really has any depth. It's a study from the perspective of a young girl. All that she observes, it's spiritual falsity, is it not? It's performative, it's mechanical, it lacks any depth. She is wearing a white dressed and it's raining. The dress has been made for her. It is a dress of guipure, of French lace with thick thread on the outline, which is in direct contrast of the white cotton sheath she wears at the time that her mother wants her to be baptized in the river. But she is wearing white, it is raining, and the lights in the opening paragraph, as the narrator remembers them, red, white, and green, slicks on the water, which had gathered in the gutters, played around my feet, winked green, the gaudy tin signs of the weather-beaten shops. Enjoy Appleton, drink Sprite. And that becomes a refrain, does it not? Throughout her monologue, she repeats that phrase. You have the juxtaposition of rum, which is among the resources of Jamaica. However, it has been, if you will, colonized by Appleton, which is a very Anglo name, and that's juxtaposed against another Western influence, drink Sprite. There are no religious banners proclaiming this day. Instead, you have what I think Senior is presenting here as a dogma of materialism, a dogma of capitalism, a dogma of profit. And the J is missing. And J is also the letter for one who would identify oneself as Jamaican. Yes. And that is absent, that identity, you see. John.
She says, they placed the veil on my head. I sighed and thought of the foolish virgins.
Yes.
And I'm curious, I have thoughts, but who in the story are these foolish virgins who aren't paying attention to what's going on?
I think everyone but the monologuist. There are 6 young girls in the confirmand group, and then there are the boys as well. And whereas they are putting the veil on her, she is, through her incredible sensitivity and her ability to discern contradictions, she is having a revelation. She is drawing back the veil herself, is she not? But as they place the veil on her head, she thinks of the wise and foolish virgins, the parable. And then there is the reference to collecting money for the oil lamps in Burma.
Right.
She makes that association, which is such, I think, so indicative of her incredible innocent imagination as well. But what registers most upon her is that if they are taking up the second collection for the oil lamps in Burma, and imagines that it's very dark in Burma and that they don't have light, and she imagines that they perhaps are poorer than they are. So I think, John, what it does is to introduce this poverty, which is palpable to this young confirmand, which is then in direct contrast with their having to make sacrifice for others, and she doesn't even know where Burma is. And then you have the appearance of the bishop in his fine vestments. While the church's walls, the plaster is peeling, there are bat droppings, the organ is wheezing, it's raining, these artificial commercial colors flashing outside in the rain. And the bishop arrives in a chauffeur-driven car, and the chauffeur emerges and has this ostentatious timepiece. And as the young children, the actual children of the parson see, it's not working, it doesn't have the correct time, and furthermore, in his illiteracy, he can't tell the time. Because as they sing in that song, he looks up at the sun to tell the time. So it really becomes, does it not then, John, this study in this ostentatious performance lacking any sacramental depth. Senior draws this as a study through the monologue, is remembering this. It's presented as a study in spiritual falsity. There have been the lessons in the catechism, and on this particular day, they are to be sealed in the Holy Spirit. And this innocent child who has not yet conformed to all of the externals is presented in this wonderful, critical posture of interrogating and seeing contradiction. The grandmother who sings off key. And again, we have the absence of a mother figure. That's one of the themes that we've encountered. We have 3 generations, and there's always the distance between the mother and the child. We know that the mother, as the narrator remembers, had to go. We do not know what the absence is, if it were in death or if it were simply had to go to make an income, but there's an absence. And even the young priest of the people, the preacher of the people, could not save her from that suffering. But the fact that she's at this very critical age when she could become susceptible to imitating and conforming, and that's the posture in which Senior has taken her. I remember Pablo Picasso once remarked, every child is an artist. The problem is, how does the child remain an artist when the child becomes an adult? How does the child remain an artist, even advancing chronologically? And I think Picasso is suggesting that the child needs to remain curious, imaginative, and always in posture of interrogator. From the romantic poet's perspective, the loss of innocence is when the child no longer asks questions, but merely begins to imitate the adults. That's the critical posture that Senior has incarnated here, if you will, in the monologuist. Other questions or observations? Yes.
So, as I read this and I'm listening to you, I'm going back. I wrote this down when I wasn't here last week, but something that stood out to me last week was the image of her and her mother in their makeshift kitchen. And she talks about how the act of like eating was like breath, and then coming to the grandmother's home, and it's this whole process, it's this ritual, right? And how this act of eating can be like breath and can be like ritual. And when I read this, who, if I cried, would hear me among the angelic orders, and then almost she's answering it. I know I'm going to the very end, but I know we've all read it, where she says, I am shocked to discover a new power in myself. All that has gone before has no occasion, no meaning. I know instinctively that not the reeds in the river, nor the wine, nor the blood of Christ, nor the book of common prayer can conquer me. So it's almost as if this theme of breath and ritual, that there's like we need both of them. Like as human beings, we need those things that are of breath, but we also need those things that are of ritual, and we need to find the balance in them.
Right.
And I kind of am jealous of her because, man, my life would be so much easier if on my confirmation day in 8th grade, I had gotten that I am the angelic orders, that I'm hearing, that my instinctual knowing is there, and that this ritual of confirmation that she went through clarified for her that she already knew instinctively what the path was, and that this is pomp and circumstance, and it's ritual, and it's valuable. But we always have to remember that we have the angelic order within us. We have the divine inside of us that we can turn to when we feel like things aren't quite right in the situations that we're in, which is what she felt in every situation that adults were leading her into.
She's very fearful of God as God has been presented to her, just as Laura has the conception of God on clouds following her. The monologist, as a young girl, has that same conception. And the image that is described by her is that there were these lurid pictures of Jesus on clouds. And that's a very curious modifier, because if it's lurid, it is so colorful that it's harsh. And that image of God on the clouds, distant, abstracted, following one, hunting one. And so what Senior has done, as revealed to us by the monologist, is to really represent the two Christian traditions in Jamaica at the time of the young girl's confirmation. She has been exposed to her mother's church, which would be a church of perhaps native baptism. She doesn't understand why they're called brothers and sisters when they're not biologically related brothers and sisters. And this is a priest of the people, a preacher of the people, who takes people in his arms into the water and immerses them 3 times, and she sees the reeds and the mud, and she feels that if she goes down in her white cotton dress 3 times, that she's going to be obliterated, which is a very strong verb, is it not? As if her entire essence would be completely denied, obliterated. And so she flees from that effort. But we know that she says of her mother, and this is the church outside. We have an exterior and we have the interior. In the exterior setting, the mother has said to her that only God is in this setting. So we infer that this church of native baptism, that is the baptism are held outside in the river, that it's a very strict, limited understanding of the divine. There's no other God except here. That then becomes acutely juxtaposed to the influence of the Western colonial Anglican tradition inside. But in the inside, the plaster is peeling, the bats have invaded the church, the organ wheezes, her grandmother sings off-key, her aunt doesn't even sing, but looks out the window beyond the tombstones, and her silence is the subject of conjecture. They, whoever the antecedent of they is, assume that because her marriage has dissolved, that is why she doesn't speak. So you have this study in extremism, from the exterior to the interior, from this insistence that God is only here to a more sacramental tradition of the Anglican Church. And this is where we find the monologist on her confirmation day. And neither tradition is one in which she feels that she can become identified. Because whenever her mother went, wherever, however, for what reasons, that particular preacher could not prevent the suffering. And the suffering it could be from death, it could be from just the loss, the absence. There's an ambiguity there that the monologist does not feel inclined to tell us. But then, in the inside, in their white kippur dresses and their veils, and the boys wearing shoes that squeak along with the organ. And see, the real challenge that Senior confronts here as a storyteller is, this is a monologue. We have to imagine this being given on the stage. And the monologue simply comes and tells us the story. There is very much in the production of a dramatic monologue, there is an economy of props and setting. It's the voice. And the voice has to provoke all of these wonderful scenes in the auditor's eyes. And there is such an incredible engagement of our sensory faculty because of the sights and the sounds and the textures. At the same time, it's an engagement of our intellectual faculty. Both of our faculties of sense and reason are engaged. It is through this wonderful engagement of our sensory faculty that the contradictions in reason are revealed.
I wanted to touch on the aunt a little bit further.
Mm-hmm.
And that my aunt, who they said was divorced and unhappy, and then was small, thin-voiced, always just on the edge of our consciousness, in the context of being confirmed into this religion when this older woman now, she's older than 12, I mean, is thin-voiced and no voice.
No, that's right. Silence. You have the grandmother who weeps, but then she has also wept at the death of King George VI and the coronation of Elizabeth II, and now her granddaughter's confirmation. Now, it's interesting, that succession of events, the death of a king who would have been anointed, and Elizabeth, upon becoming queen, would have been anointed. But it suggests, does it not, on the part of the elderly grandmother, this sense of the indiscriminate, and it's by the grandmother's insistence that this is being imposed upon her. And she goes through the motions. She says the words, but they're just mechanical words. When she receives the chalice, she barely gets enough of the blood in the wafer. The host, she says, tastes like blotting paper, and the bishop pushes her head back. And what's, I think, very noteworthy is you do not see any pastoral exchange among the confirmands and the bishop or the parson. You see the parson's sons, and their role in the story is to sing that limerick about the chauffeur. And it's really a rather damning indictment. 1, 2, 3, 4, calling man a come. With him watch chain, a lick him belly, bam, bam, bam. Ask him for the time, and he look upon the sun. The inference is, he can't read the timepiece. It doesn't work. He has gone from Jamaica to Colon in Panama to help build the Panama Canal, and has made a profit of money whereby he can now become a chauffeur of a cleric and have this ostentatious timepiece, this external. But the fact that he has, Maureen, left Jamaica, gone to Panama, and made a profit there, it brings into question, I think, his own identity. Because we know that when he hears the young boys singing this song, he begins to go after them as well. John?
This is a really troubling story. I'm thinking of the sort of the function of gender in the story. You know, the women, as you've already said, if this is what is available to women, as this young monologuist is sort of looking out and trying to find her place. You've got grandma who cries about everything. You've got aunt who is silent about everything. You've got the organist who pedals with fury. So you've got silence, tears, and fury.
Wheezing,
yes. And then you have this male god who is always described as terrifying, obliterating, lurid, which is, for me, it's that word that there's something sinister.
There is.
I mean, sort of lurking, not even behind the scenes. His judgment was swift and terrible. He's got clouds of terror, the terrible reality of his existence. I would be obliterated by his greatness. There's something almost dare I say, sadomasochistic about this God who's going to obliterate young girls by his greatness. And I keep waiting for her to just run away, which of course at the end, her salvation is in that she sees that there's nothing to this.
Right.
But that this is the religious landscape
Yes.
that, you know, and whether all the other kids are experiencing the same kind of religious phenomena as she is, she seems very attuned, almost with kind of synesthesia. I mean, she's very, very aware of both sense perceptions and their flowing into aesthetic and moral judgments and back. I mean, seems like sometimes she's on the verge of a break. And for her to finally see, okay, there's no power, but none of this can conquer me.
Right.
But she's still left without a place.
Right. And there's when you look at the representation of women, you have the grandmother who seems to be, does she not, governed by sentiment and by structure. You know, there is a regimented time for meal, there's a regimented time to be confirmed. It's that bringing together both the secular ritual and the sacred ritual as well, who doesn't seem to discriminate among them. You know, as I said, the death of George VI, the coronation of Elizabeth, and then the confirmation, all elicit the same response. And then you have the absent mother, and her voice, when it is, as it is remembered by the monologuist, is a voice also that really is, it's not a compromising voice. There is but one God, and that God is here. And that God is not to be found in the church of the Western tradition.
But they're the same God.
They
They're
are.
both trying to kill the same woman.
Exactly. And so that's where we find the speaker on confirmation, in this posture of not being able to accept either of the two confessional traditions in Jamaica. And instead, at the end, refusing to conform to all of this, what she sees as empty formalism, is to see the car of the bishop reduced to the size of a beetle. Her gaze, you know, she hasn't compromised herself. But then the question that you bring up, John, is important. What is next for her? What is next for her by virtue of her gender?
Right.
You know, we infer as an adult remembering this day. And in the tradition of the dramatic monologue, whatever the subject of the monologue is, it is assumed to be an event that is indispensable to one's private history. And so this has made a profound, indelible impression upon her to at whatever age she is telling us that she is confessing. We're like in the role of confessor. We're hearing her confession, and we hear it. We're auditors. We don't ask questions. We merely have this, as a reader, we have this ministry of presence. We hear her story. And she's extremely honest with us. It is, that's why it's referred to as confessional literature, certainly. See, your hand was up first, and then yours.
In talking about the grandmother crying at the death, the coronation, I sort of read that also as England's control over Jamaica.
Yeah.
And they imposed the Anglican Church. The king dies, and then the successor follows. And so this is how you're taking away the Jamaican sensibility.
And think of this. Think of how grand both the funeral rite and the anointing of the next monarch, in contrast to the poverty in which the young girl finds herself on the day of her confirmation. Remember in the painterly, in Larissa's room, as she writes the icon on the wall, there is this juxtaposition of the royal family of England next to the Holy Family, And we discussed how that perhaps is Larissa's way of writing iconographically a profound theological statement, which Olive Sr. through Lorraine tells us. But there's that same effect here, I think, of a juxtaposition between the monarchy and the royalty and the grandeur and the pageantry, and the effort here in the white dresses and the new brown shoes. And I think the question that Senior is begging us to ask is, on this day, white French lace, new shoes, the boys are behaving in a discipline for the duration of the service. But what about the next day? What about the next day when the white dresses are taken off and the veils are taken off and the boys return to their bare feet? Well, now, I think there's an undeniable indictment that is being made here, that for this particular occasion. But what about the next day? And
I can't help but think about currently the synodal, the discussions that we've been having in light of what is church for us now, the Catholic Church, and what has it been, and what it might be in the future, and so I just wonder, it's not only this young gal, but how many other young people who have been cradle Catholics have gone through this experience, and so when they reach a certain level of adulthood, there is not a connection of the dots to their own spiritual growth. That it's just ritual. That it's like mumbo jumbo type of thing. And I think this essay has just really raised more questions about the formation process, and not only young people but also adults. And I know we've just been going through a big family reunion, and my husband's sister-in-law was raised Catholic, and she just now and she's 86, cannot understand why we have a crucifix, and suffering, and I think here she's been raised as a Catholic all this time, and it has no meaning. I mean, it's like I just want to have my own faith experience, me and God. I don't need the church
or community.
Or anything. So anyway, I would love your comment.
Well, the speaker, the monologuist, is one who is, as we hear of this event from her life, we infer is still quite disaffected by both of the confessional traditions represented in the story. Neither has been a tradition to which she feels that she can circumscribe her identity by. I think one of the questions that we infer is about all of those catechism lessons that were conducted by the Anglican parson. And what we infer is that they have been perhaps rote memorization, learning the responses, that they have been more performative. I think that's a safe inference for us to make. And this particular monologuist, as a young confirmand, cannot accept the script.
That's right.
And it really, what I think Senior has incarnated here is a study, as I said earlier, in empty formalism. It's the form of the white dress and the brown shoes and the procession and the words, but it's empty formalism. And then Carol, and then Maureen.
It's possible that this title, confirmation, is her being confirmed in her new way of looking at it.
Yes.
Like she became an orphan on
Mhm.
purpose. You know, she's
Mhm.
liberated now.
Mhm.
I'm confirmed in being free.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, she is in a way like Laura, declaring herself orphaned, declaring her own independence. But then going back to the question that John presents, what is there for her? Yes, to declare her independence, but what about being in relation to others in an effort to no longer feel so disaffected?
Well, that's to come.
Yes, yes, but she confirms herself in a way, which is a very bold statement to make. But to declare her independence, she is confirming her own unique, unrepeatable self, and refuses to circumscribe her identity around all of these other aspects which she sees to be false. Maureen?
When you were talking about the formalism of the confirmation, I'm guessing that Olive Sr. is remembering her own, and at her age, she would have had an experience pre-Vatican II. I did, and I remember my confirmation preparation in Catholic school. We were drilled on the answers to the questions that the bishop would ask, and our teacher wanted us to make sure every single person raised their hand when the bishop asked a question. And boy, you better know it. And walking in, they used to have those clickers. We would march in, and then you hear the little clicker, and everybody genuflects at once, and then they're very military. You get in your pew, and then you hope to God the bishop doesn't call on you, but you raise your hand, and then it was all about all of that.
Yes.
It wasn't about your faith, receiving the Holy Spirit. It was about, the bishop will tap your cheek, and, it won't be hard, but, you're going to get that. And just everything that you do, and what you wear, and all of it. And she liberates herself at the end when she leaves the church. She walks out of the church, and then, outside the doors is where she feels her own freedom.
And her gaze, her perspective in seeing this rather ostentatious automobile with chauffeur is reduced in her eyes to this minuscule size of a beetle.
Yeah. Well, and the clouds. The
Yes.
clouds aren't there, but
Right.
there's this inference that they're not going to be so scary.
Right.
It's just
Yeah. Her gaze is the perspective of seeing this so very minuscule, and perhaps that's indicative of how she sees all of this so disproportionate itself. Let's see, there were other hands that John?
A couple of responses and then a comment. One, I think an alternative interpretation could be that, if we're going to use our theological imaginations, maybe she doesn't confirm herself. Maybe there is a divine confirmation that comes from
The Spirit?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I see this in this line. I'd rather be a child of someone else.
Yes.
Being a child of God.
Yes.
And in the way that, and so I also think we could read this as saying, despite all the stuff, somehow she finds a new power in her.
Yes.
And it's given through, it doesn't happen apart from this whole empty ritual, but nevertheless, the empty ritual is necessary to be the scaffold to fall away.
Yes, to fall, yes.
And I say that just because I think that can help us who are in these scaffolds and in these rituals to see that God doesn't happen other places, but when God happens here, we can't expect anything but this sort of this is empty. The other comment I might make is that the sorts of reflections that are going on here and that we are sharing are precisely the experiences that led to the advent of liberation theology in the Southern Hemisphere.
Yes.
Seeing this empty framework, but this compelling narrative, or this compelling theological content, the story of God and Jesus and the poor, and people saying, well, can we do this? Can we have a God who is with us?
Yes.
Instead of creating rituals that help us worship this other frightening cloud, white God, can we, is Jesus one of us? Is God one of us?
Yes.
And so the impulse there, but of course that becomes incredibly divisive. And the final point I would make is that she's still haunted by this. So whatever freedom she's given, she's writing years later, and she can remember how. So it's, if there's liberation, she's writing this for someone. So it's not as though she hasn't thought about it and is utterly free. No, she's still a little.
She's
bit
telling us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
It's
I think
how
I'm glad for that, because
Yes.
that's where revolution and reformation
Right.
comes from.
Right.
People who aren't going to let go,
Right.
because they know there's something. There are other people who need to hear this.
I think there is, in support of your claim, John, that there is a confirmation. I think the Spirit comes upon her. And she's not able to articulate it, she's just able to experience it by virtue of her senses. There's a different perspective that she has in the end. So I think there is a descent of the Spirit upon her that leads her to see this is not of depth, that there is more. Let's see, Jim, and then.
Yeah, I think to me the key was the line about the bishop's car being a small black beetle in a vast green world. That's what offers me a ribbon of hope that she sees that there is the next day, or there is something of the next day.
Yes. I love that shift in perspective in the end, because he goes from this very formidable figure in these very fine vestments, in contrast to the poverty to which they will return the next day.
With a driver.
And you do not see him in any time engaging with them. It's all just a formal processional. And also, I was just thinking, John, in terms of your saying the fact that she is still telling us this story years later, the impression that this has made upon her, and how very visual and audible this experience from the past is in her presence, I think Senior as author encourages that and wants us to have that feeling because of the way that the monologue is delivered. It's not delivered in complete declarative sentences. It's one successive fused sentence. It's through the stream of consciousness without any breaks. And so the fact that it is told years later, however many that is, with such intensity and such passion, allows us then to infer that this is indeed an experience from her biography that is, the speaker's biography, that is undeniably indelible.
And we get even, there's one paragraph where it seems like it breaks out of that, and it's like, the scene is back to her writing. It's on page 83, where, the tone shifts from portraying this experience to a much cooler analysis. This time I know it is not easy for me to escape. The formality of my grandmother's church has woven a pattern from which it is difficult to break out. This is grammar. This is sort of proper grammar.
Yes.
Prayer, all these things created a mold into which the crazy, mad fragments of my other disordered life were being squeezed. And it's beautiful prose, and also it doesn't match.
Right.
It is this inbreaking of this later perspective.
Exactly. Created a mold into which the crazy mad fragments of my other disordered life were being squeezed, and so I know it is no longer a dream. It goes back to the extremism that we were discussing earlier. And to mold is to impose, to mold is to conform. Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think there's this wonderful interplay between the vowels I and O. Yes, in your comment.
I was thought I would connect with what John was, also your reflections, John, where she says on the last page, 84, the last paragraph, I am shocked to discover a new power in myself. Now, she cannot articulate what it is, but
Right.
she knows this.
Yes,
Yeah.
it is. It's intuitive.
Yeah.
It cannot be located in language. Even to the time that we're given the monologue. To this day, that mystery still does not give her the language to locate it conclusively or
But
definitively.
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Exactly. Whatever it was, is, and has had a profound effect upon her. She doesn't have the vocabulary for it at the age of being a confirmant, and she doesn't have it today when she tells us the story either. This, it's as if, mystery does intercede into her life, because all else that's described, there's nothing mysterious in it. Whether it's from the sense of olfaction or the sense of sight, she can place and name every other aspect of this stimuli that's overwhelming her. She can name it and locate it specifically. But at the end, that which is beyond language, beyond knowing, beyond reason, beyond sensory faculty, is upon her, and I think it is the Spirit, certainly. Yes, and then Carol after that.
And I think it's this freedom. So you brought up a few, I guess, earlier in the month about the capitalization. And I mean, obviously, I K through 12 Catholic school, so I know you capitalize God. But I also feel like this story is also the story of her mother dying.
Mm-hmm.
Because as she's remembering, as she's transitioning into this prose that you talked about on page 83, where the disordered life was being squeezed, and so I know it is no longer a dream. She has been reliving the baptism that her mother brought her to. That was a baptism that was not her baptism. And then she says, yet when she had to go, not even the God of the man of the people could save her of the suffering, right? So it's like all of these gods, she's got capitalized. She's got the God of the man of the people that couldn't save her mother from suffering. So clearly her mother died of a horrendous suffering that she had to live through and endure. So of course that's going to stay with her well beyond, right? And then now she's playing this game because she doesn't have a choice, right? And there's no escape for me this time. The formality of my grandmother's church has woven a pattern from which it is difficult to break out. So because she's there, her mother's dead, she gets sent here. Now she's playing the game in this church. And as she sees the game, and now, this is page 84, and standing now facing them, I catch sight of her in the singing congregation, her grandmother. She looks happy and shining, and I know it is because of me. She believes that I have been saved. So it's the Savior. Like, she got saved with the baptism. Her mother wanted her to be saved. Go, pour yourself into the water 3 times, you will be saved. And then she watched her mother die. And so there's such a bitterness as a child to lose a parent and be told your whole life that you just need to follow the Lord Jesus Christ and it will all work out, right? And then somebody goes and doesn't ever come back, and you have to live with that as you go through and become an adult in the church, right? And so here she is again. Oh, my grandmother now believes that I have been saved. Maybe the mother of her own daughter who's died, right? The mother has died. She goes to the grandmother. She's living with that. I know it because of me. She believes that I have been saved. Become a child of God, believes in some truth in me. And then you love your grandmother, but I cannot tell you, right? She is done. This God is not her God. And then at the very end, that last child of God on page 84, when she talks about God here at the end, it's lowercase now. All that has gone before has no occasion, no meaning. I know instinctively that not the reeds in the river, nor the wine, nor the blood of Christ, nor the book of the common prayer can conquer me. And not a single cloud of God is in that sky. And it's like she's released this belief system that everyone has put upon her of what God should be or should look like. And so the confirmation feels to me like the next day she's on the path and she can see the green, and she can now make a decision as to whether she wants to go back in to the beetle priest and listen to him and learn from his teachings, but it's on her, it's her terms now, in a way that is just so eloquent, because she knows that we're not, like, that's not what it means to be saved. It doesn't mean that our bodily flesh gets saved. And I think that so often that gets so confused as a kid coming through, because we're often told to pray about it, and that doesn't always mentally fix the trauma, and you carry it all through your life.
Carol and then John.
I had 3 points to make short. The first one is that we were confirmed in 5th grade because they were going to catch us before puberty. And we wouldn't be tempted, or we could withstand the temptations of puberty. That was why they told us. And then they went, after Vatican II, they went to the high school kids. And John and I found ourselves as teachers of confirmation for 2 years. And the most important thing that we did, I think this is great, that the kids were told to bring in magazine articles and newspaper articles and current events, and then we would discuss those in light of the gospel. And I think they liked that a lot. And the third thing is Thomas Aquinas. He, at the end of his life, all of Summa Theologica was rubbish. And he couldn't, it was ineffable. I don't think he could explain quite what had happened to him.
It's all straw.
Which burns.
Yes.
That's right.
John.
I think the challenge for me, and maybe for all of us who want to maintain a connection to this community, this tradition, is to ask whether there is anything else to do here but create, this line that keeps coming back to me in 83, is what we're doing here creating a mold into which the crazy, mad fragments of our other disordered lives are squeezed. And if not, what do we do with those fragments, as a people, as a community? Because we do have rituals, and we know that rituals are helpful and important at times. But what is the alternative here for us to accepting these things as molds? Because I think people instinctively get this, and more people are instinctively rejecting this because they think there is value in the disordered fragments of the wildlife. Maybe that's as key to who I am. And so if they don't fit here, what do we do with them? Do we have are we accountable to that as Catholics, as a community? And I raise that as a question because I wonder that. I'm hoping that we can figure out how to integrate both the sacramental, ritual, liturgical elements of our tradition, which keep it alive, and also the aspects of ourselves which feel squeezed into that, which pop out. And that seems to me, if she has a challenge for us, and there are many, but that is definitely one of them.
I like the image of God as artisan and clay, because clay is from the earth and it has flaws and impurities, and it's malleable with the potter's hands, and it's not always centered, but even though it's not, it can be recast. I like the image of the earth and the hands, the work of human hands. And we hear that in the Eucharistic prayer when the gifts are brought to the altar, the work of human hands, and through the work of human hands, grace is mediated. So, for what that's worth.
Yes.
Yeah, I offer that as a somewhat encounter to the idea of mold.
Right. Rigid.
You know, because, you know, I when I teach Flannery O'Connor's short story, Revelation, the title that I give to that lecture is The God of Slip Mold Ceramics, because you have the molds and you pour the slip and you get this quota of and that's how the protagonist thinks that God has made her a perfect Southern Christian lady. He could have made her trash, he could have made her African American, but he made her Ruby Turpin, a Southern proper lady that wears the proper shoes to the doctor's office. The molding, as opposed to an understanding of clay and how mixed with the other elements of air and fire and water, it assumes shape. And even if it breaks, it can be recast. So I like it, but the idea of mold is more, I think, in this case, it's become the empty formalism as well, you know. So, other comments or questions, Maureen and Mike?
Oh, sorry, one other little thing, in the missing J in the boy, I thought it was Jesus that's missing.
Well, indeed, one can make an argument for that as well. Yeah, because I think one of the inferences we can make about all of the lessons that have occurred as preparing the students for the confirmation is just how has God been presented to them? You know, in these lurid images that are so bold in color that they're just harsh. I mean, when I think lurid, to me, suggests the seamy. Something you would not discuss in polite society. You know, that was something reserved, off color, and it's so intensely colorful that it's really off color, so to speak. Yeah. So, the absence of the J. Mike?
I gotta confess, I didn't read any of this. I listened to YouTubes of Richard Rohr and Thomas Keating all week. Instead, I did put my time in that. But what goes through my head now as I listen to all of this is maybe all these rituals and all the shenanigans we get put through from the second grade until the day we die are not answers. But there are things to cause us to question what the hell's going on, what's going on in me, what's going on around me, to come up with answers after the ceremonial thing. That's what Dexter's process. He doesn't give you an answer at church. You'll figure it out in the middle of the week. Kind of stuff. So.
Well, and that takes me back to another quotation by Rilke from the epigraph in his letters to a young poet. Rilke says to this young man who wants to become a writer, he tells him, love the questions, like locked rooms or books that are written in a very foreign tongue. Do not seek the answers because you cannot live the answers. Live the questions. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah, live the questions.
And they're different for everybody.
Yes, but yet they have common threads.
They're all correct.
Exactly. Precisely. Maureen, and you're describing your preparation for confirmation.
It's still in there.
You
should write a short.
When I was in first and second grade, and we had to write with pencils that didn't have erasers. And it was like if you didn't recite verbatim the question, you started over, and if you made a mistake in your tablet, which was very thin newsprint, you couldn't erase. You started over again. I went through more tablets. So, any other closing comments or questions? Yes?
It's a small point, but as you went back to this bit about Burma,
Yeah.
I'm thinking it popped into my mind seeing maps when I was younger. Burma was also pink. It was also part of the British Empire.
Yes.
And she knows that one very impoverished part of the British Empire is supposed to be sending funds to another very even more impoverished part of the British Empire. And so what is this Anglican ceremony going to do for her? I mean, not what it should, perhaps.
And she even has that wonderful moment when she wonders if the lamps in Burma are as gilded like the lamps that she has known. Yeah.
Just made me remember in elementary school, we used to take up collections in our classroom for pagan babies.
Gosh.
Yes. And however much money you brought in, that was the number of pagan babies that you were saving.
It's like Brideshead. The youngest sister Cordelia
Mhm.
is raising money for her African or black
Yes.
baby.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and we
Yeah.
would take pride in how many we saved that
A
year.
god of quotas, Maureen.
$5, it was $5.
Yeah.
Yeah. The god of quotas, the god of a very crude arithmetic. A very crude arithmetic, not a god of infinite mathematics and exponents.
Well, thank you.
And they-
Let's have a formal close and then.